The dog was almost dead when it collapsed on his boot. 40 pounds of bone and scar tissue, too weak to lift its own head. And it chose the leather boot of the most feared man in a parking lot full of 800 Hells Angels. Dean Hargrove hadn't touched a living thing gently in years. His hands had rebuilt engines, thrown punches, carried a flag-draped coffin. Now they hovered over a dying pit bull that the world had thrown away. The same way the world had thrown away men like him. What happened next shut down a town, crashed the internet, and shattered every lie people had ever told about men in leather. But nobody was ready for what Dean whispered to that dog when he thought no one was listening. The desert floor shook before anyone saw them coming. 800 motorcycles rolling through the high plains of northwestern Arizona made a sound that didn't belong to any natural order. A low, grinding roar that traveled through the sun-baked earth and rattled the windows of every gas station and diner along Route 66, between Seligman and Kingman. Dust climbed in wide amber curtains behind the column, swallowing the road in their wake, and the July sun pressed down on chrome and leather and asphalt with the patience of something that had been burning for 1 billion years and intended to keep going. Dean Hargrove rode near the front of the pack, his hands loose on the handlebars of the Black Road King he'd rebuilt twice since buying it in 2006. At 54, Dean carried the kind of physical presence that made strangers step aside without thinking about it. 6'3", 240 pounds of chest and shoulder packed into a leather vest so covered in patches and pins that the original black was barely visible. His beard, once dark as motor oil, had gone the color of iron filings, and it hung to his sternum in a thick braid. His eyes, sunk beneath a heavy brow, were the pale blue of bleached denim, and they rarely blinked. He was the president of the Kingman chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, and on this particular Saturday in mid-July, he was leading the largest charity ride the chapter had organized in its 31-year history. The annual Ride for the Forgotten, as they called it, raised money for the county's underfunded veterans shelter, a cause Dean had championed since returning from his second tour in Iraq, with a Purple Heart, a steel rod in his left femur, and a silence that his ex-wife once described as a room nobody was allowed to enter. The formation stretched nearly 2 miles along the old highway. Riders from 11 chapters across Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California had answered the call, and the convoy had picked up another 40 independents along the way. Men and women who rode without a club, but understood the unwritten language of the road. The thunder of their engines had become a kind of heartbeat, steady and vast, and the people who stood along the roadside in Kingman watched them pass with expressions that ranged from cautious awe to undisguised fear. Dean noticed those faces the way he always did, with a flat indifference that had become second nature. He had stopped caring what people thought of him somewhere around the age of 30, or at least that was what he told himself. The truth was more complicated, but he kept the truth in the same locked room as everything else that hurt, and he had long since lost interest in finding the key. The column began to slow as it approached the rally point, a sprawling gravel lot behind the old Route 66 Motor Hotel on the east side of town. The hotel had been closed for years, its neon sign dark and peeling, but the lot was flat and wide enough to hold 600 bikes with room to spare. And the owner, a retired trucker named Lyle Beckett, donated it to the club every summer without asking for $1. Dust billowed as the bikes peeled off the highway in pairs, filling the lot in orderly rows with the precision of men who understood formation, riding the way soldiers understood marching. Dean killed his engine and swung his leg over the seat. The sudden absence of the Road King's rumble left a ringing silence that pressed against his eardrums. He planted both boots on the gravel and stood there for a moment, rolling the stiffness out of his shoulders, feeling the heat radiate up through his soles. The temperature was 107 degrees, and the air tasted of dust and diesel and the faint mineral sharpness of the desert. Colt Benson, the chapter's vice president, pulled in beside him and cut his engine. Colt was 10 years younger than Dean and built like a middleweight fighter, compact, quick, with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like it had been squared off with a carpenter's level. He had a tattoo of a coiled rattlesnake on his left forearm and a daughter in the 3rd grade who called him Daddy Bear. He swung off his bike and stretched his arms overhead, cracking his knuckles against the white sky. 812, Colt said, squinting back at the column still filing in. Might hit 850 by sundown. Dean nodded but didn't answer. His attention had drifted to the edge of the lot, where the gravel gave way to a strip of dead grass and a chain-link fence that separated the property from an abandoned rail spur. Something was moving along the fence line, low, slow, barely distinguishable from the heat shimmer rising off the ground. He took 2 steps forward and stopped. It was a dog, or what was left of one. The animal moved with the broken, lurching gait of a creature operating on the last fumes of something that wasn't quite willpower, because dogs didn't have willpower. It was something older, something wired into the marrow. The body's blind refusal to stop, even when stopping, was the only mercy left. It was a pit bull mix, medium-sized, though starvation had carved it down to a shape that was mostly angles. The ridgeline of the spine, the rack of ribs, the sharp jut of hip bones pressing against skin that was the dull grey of old concrete. Scars laced its muzzle and shoulders, some healed into pale ridges, others still raw and crusted. One ear was torn halfway through. Its eyes were half closed against the glare, and it walked with its head so low that its nose nearly dragged the gravel. Dean stood still. The dog reached the edge of the lot, stumbled once, and kept coming. Not toward Dean specifically, not toward anything specific, just forward, because forward was the only direction left. It reached him and stopped. It stood there for 3 or 4 seconds, swaying, and then its legs folded and it lay down directly on top of Dean's right boot. Its eyes closed. The sound of 800 motorcycles cooling in the Arizona heat was the only noise in the world. Dean didn't move. He stood with his right boot pinned beneath the collapsed animal and looked down at it with an expression that, to anyone watching, would have been impossible to read. His face was the same granite mask he wore in church and in bar fights, and at the funerals of men he'd ridden with for decades, a face built to reveal nothing. But something shifted behind his eyes, something quick and involuntary, like a door blown open by a gust of wind before being slammed shut again. The dog's breathing was shallow and fast, its rib cage fluttering with the desperate rhythm of a body running out of time. Up close, the damage was worse than it had appeared at a distance. The scars on its muzzle were old and layered, the kind that came from repeated trauma, not a single incident. Its paws were raw and cracked, the pads split from walking on hot asphalt without rest. There were patches on its flanks where the fur had fallen out entirely, revealing skin that was sunburned and peeling. The animal's body radiated heat that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. It was the dry, feverish warmth of infection and dehydration. Dean, Colt, had come up behind him and was staring down at the dog with his hands on his hips. "The hell is that?" "Dog. I can see it's a dog. I mean, what's it doing on your boot?" Dean didn't answer. He was watching the animal's eyes. They were closed, but the lids twitched. And every few seconds a tremor ran through its body, a full-length shudder that started at the shoulders and rippled down to the tail. The tail itself was tucked so tightly against the dog's belly that it was barely visible. Frank Calloway appeared at Dean's left shoulder. Frank was the chapter's road captain and its oldest active member. 68, rail-thin, with a white handlebar mustache and the weathered, creased face of a man who had been riding in open sun since the Johnson administration. He had a voice like gravel being poured into a tin bucket, and he used it sparingly. "That animal's about done," Frank said quietly. "I know." "You gonna move?" "Not yet." Word traveled fast through 800 riders. Within 5 minutes, a loose semicircle had formed around Dean and the dog. 30, 40 men, standing at a respectful distance, arms crossed, watching. The conversations that had been building across the lot, the handshakes and backslaps, and the rough, loud camaraderie of men who saw each other once or twice a year, had gone quiet in this corner of the gravel. There was something about the scene that discouraged noise. A man the size of a refrigerator standing motionless in the heat while a half-dead dog slept on his boot. It had the weight of something that wasn't supposed to be interrupted. A younger rider, Kyle Ashford, a prospect from the Flagstaff chapter who was maybe 25 and still carried himself with the nervous energy of someone trying too hard, stepped forward and reached down toward the dog. "I can move it for you, sir. Just grab it by the—" "Don't touch it." Dean's voice was low and flat, and Kyle's hand stopped in mid-air as though it had hit a wall. The prospect stepped back without another word. Colt leaned in close to Dean's ear. "Brother, we got the ceremony in 40 minutes. The mayor's coming. Press is coming. We can't have—" I said don't touch it. Silence. Dean looked down at the animal again. It had shifted slightly, pressing its muzzle harder against the leather of his boot, and one of its front paws had curled over the toe. The gesture was not affection. Dean knew that. It was not trust, not gratitude, not any of the human things people like to project onto animals. It was something simpler and more devastating. A body that had been running on fear and pain for so long that when it finally found something solid and warm that didn't kick it or throw rocks at it, the machinery just stopped. It was exhaustion finding a surface, and Dean understood that. He understood it in a place that had nothing to do with thinking. "Somebody get me water," he said, "and find out if there's a vet in this town who's open on a Saturday." The semicircle broke. Men moved. Colt was already pulling out his phone, scrolling with his thumb, and Frank was walking toward the row of trucks and trailers that had followed the convoy in, looking for the supply cooler. Kyle Ashford, eager to redeem himself, jogged toward the old hotel to see if the water spigot on the side of the building still worked. A bottle of water appeared in Dean's hand, passed to him by a rider he didn't recognize, a heavy-set man with a Z's-top beard and a Tucson chapter patch. Dean cracked the cap and poured a slow stream onto the gravel beside the dog's head, letting the water pool in a shallow depression in the ground. The dog didn't move. He poured more, closer to its muzzle, and this time the nostrils flared, a tiny reflexive flicker, and the tongue emerged, cracked and pale, and began to lap weakly at the puddle. "Easy," Dean said, not to the dog exactly, to the situation, to the heat, to whatever part of the universe was responsible for dropping a dying animal at the feet of a man who had spent 30 years building a reputation for being untouchable. Colt came back. Found a vet clinic on Stockton Hill Road, Pemberton Animal Care. Answering machine says they close at noon on Saturdays. Call again. Dean, call again and don't stop calling until someone picks up. Colt looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and stepped away with the phone pressed to his ear. Frank returned with a cooler and set it down beside Dean. He opened it, pulled out a bag of ice, and without a word, laid it on the ground next to the dog's hindquarters. The animal flinched at the cold, but didn't try to move. Its eyes were still closed. Frank crouched down and studied the dog with the quiet, practical assessment of a man who had grown up on a cattle ranch outside of Prescott and had seen more injured animals than most veterinarians. "Pit bull mix," Frank said. "Maybe 40 pounds. Should be 60, 65. Those scars on the face aren't from fights with other dogs. They're from people. Somebody used this animal and then threw it out when it stopped being useful." Dean said nothing. He was looking at the scars. "Might not make it even with a vet," Frank added. "Might not. You want to do this anyway." It wasn't a question. Frank had known Dean for 19 years. He'd watched him ride through rainstorms and funerals and the kind of grief that makes most men quit everything. He knew what that particular set of Dean's jaw meant. "Yeah," Dean said, "I want to do this anyway." The call went through on the 7th try. Dr. Ruth Pemberton was at home when her clinic phone forwarded to her cell. Sitting at her kitchen table in a house on the north side of Kingman, with a glass of iced tea and a crossword puzzle, and the particular kind of Saturday afternoon peace that comes from having earned it through 5 straight days of 14-hour shifts. She was 51, slender with short auburn hair going silver at the temples, and the steady hands of a woman who had been performing surgeries on animals for 26 years. She had moved to Kingman from Flagstaff 8 years ago to open her own practice, and she had built it into something the community depended on through the simple formula of showing up, doing the work, and never turning an animal away. She listened to Colt's explanation with the phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, and the peace of her Saturday evaporated in stages. "How many of you are there?" she asked. "About 800. A pause. 800 Hell's Angels, at the old Route 66 lot." "Yes, ma'am." Another pause, longer this time. Ruth Pemberton was not a woman given to prejudice, or at least she didn't think of herself that way. But she was a woman who read the news and locked her doors at night and had a very clear mental image of what a Hells Angels gathering looked like, and that image did not include the words "rescued dog" or "please help." She thought about saying she was closed. She thought about recommending the emergency clinic in Bullhead City, 40 minutes south. She thought about a lot of things in the space of about 6 seconds. Then she thought about the dog. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, she said. "Don't give it food. Small amounts of water only. Keep it out of direct sun if you can." She hung up, put on her shoes, loaded her emergency kit into the back of her truck, and drove toward the east side of town with a feeling in her stomach that was equal parts professional urgency and personal unease. What she found when she pulled into the gravel lot was nothing she could have prepared for. The motorcycles stretched in rows that seemed to go on forever, chrome glinting under the sun like the scales of some enormous sleeping creature. And around one particular spot near the fence line, a crowd of maybe 80 men had gathered. Bearded, tattooed, wearing leather and denim and boots and bandanas, every one of them looking like the kind of person a casting director would hire to play a villain in a movie about the end of the world. They were standing in a rough circle, and they were quiet, not talking, not drinking, not doing any of the things Ruth had imagined they'd be doing, just standing there, watching something on the ground. She parked her truck and got out. The crowd parted for her without a word, opening a path to the center of the circle like a gate swinging open, and she walked through it carrying her medical bag with her chin up and her pulse hammering in her throat. Dean Hargrove was sitting on the ground. That was the first thing that didn't match. The president of the Hells Angels, a man whose mugshot she had almost certainly seen in the Kingman Daily Miner at some point over the years, was sitting in the dirt and gravel with his legs stretched out in front of him and a half-dead pit bull lying across his right thigh. He had fashioned a shade cover from someone's leather jacket, propping it between a cooler and a saddlebag to block the sun from the dog's head. His massive hands were resting on the ground at his sides, palms up, deliberately not touching the animal, giving it space even while giving it shelter. He looked up when Ruth approached. "You the vet?" "Dr. Pemberton, yes." "It won't drink anymore. Had a little water about 20 minutes ago, but it stopped." Ruth knelt down and opened her bag. She pulled on gloves and began her assessment with the kind of efficient, focused calm that comes from doing something you've done 1,000 times. She checked the dog's gums. Pale, almost white, capillary refill time well over 3 seconds. Dehydration was severe. She palpated the abdomen gently and felt the dog's muscles tense, a weak, involuntary guarding. The lymph nodes were swollen. Temperature, taken carefully, was 105.2, dangerously high even for a dog in the Arizona summer. The ears were infected, the paws were raw to the point of bleeding, and when she lifted the lip to check the teeth, she found several broken, likely from chewing on metal or concrete in desperation. "This dog has been on its own for a long time," she said, not looking up. "Weeks, maybe longer. The scarring on the muzzle and chest is consistent with—" She hesitated. "With what?" Dean asked. "With abuse, prolonged and deliberate. Someone hurt this animal repeatedly over a long period before abandoning it." A sound moved through the crowd, not a word, not a gasp, just a low, collective exhalation that carried something heavy in it. Ruth glanced up and saw 80 faces wearing the same expression, and it was not the expression she had expected to find. There was no indifference. There was no casual cruelty. What she saw on face after face was anger, the quiet, controlled kind that doesn't shout, the kind that tightens jaws and narrows eyes and clenches fists slowly at the sides. These men were furious, and they were furious on behalf of the dog. "Can you save it?" Dean asked. Ruth looked at the animal. Its breathing was still shallow, still rapid, and the tremors hadn't stopped. She had seen dogs in this condition before. Some of them made it. Many of them didn't. The honest answer was that she didn't know, and the professional answer was that she shouldn't make promises. "I need to get it to my clinic. It needs IV fluids, antibiotics, blood work. I can't do what it needs out here in a parking lot." "Then let's go. I need to be clear with you, Mr. Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove, this dog may not survive the night, even with treatment. The dehydration alone has likely caused organ stress, and if there's an internal infection—" "I heard you." Dean looked at her with those pale blue eyes, and for a moment Ruth saw something behind the granite exterior that made her breath catch. A rawness, an old wound reopened, the look of a man staring at something that reminded him of something he'd lost. "I'm asking you to try." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, then nodded. "I'll try." The convoy that followed Ruth Pemberton's truck to her clinic on Stockton Hill Road was not something the residents of Kingman would soon forget. She had expected Dean and maybe 1 or 2 others. What she got was a rolling wall of thunder. Dean's Road King directly behind her truck, Colt and Frank flanking him, and behind them a river of chrome and leather that stretched back 4 blocks. They rode slowly, deliberately, their engines at a low growl that resonated off the storefronts and made the traffic lights sway on their cables. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared. A woman walking out of the Dollar General dropped her bag and stood frozen with her hand over her mouth. 2 teenagers on skateboards pulled onto the curb and watched the column pass with their phones raised, recording video that would be on the internet within the hour. Not all 800 rode. That would have gridlocked the town, but enough did, 150, maybe 200, that the message was unmistakable. This mattered. This small, broken, discarded thing lying in the front seat of a veterinarian's pickup truck mattered enough to mobilize a force that most people associated with everything except mercy. At the clinic, Ruth carried the dog inside with Dean holding the door. She placed it on the exam table. The animal was limp, barely responsive, and began working with the swift, focused intensity of a combat medic. IV catheter in the front leg. Lactated Ringer's solution running wide open. Blood draw for a CBC and chemistry panel. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, injectable, because there was no chance this dog could keep down oral medication. A mild sedative to ease the tremors that were now almost continuous. The body's distress signal repeating on a loop. Dean stood in the corner of the exam room with his arms crossed. He didn't speak. He didn't get in the way. He just stood there, watching, and his presence filled the room the way a boulder fills a stream. Immovable, silent, changing the current around it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile blue glow across the steel table, and the clinic smelled of antiseptic and the faint, sour undertone of an animal in deep physiological distress. The contrast between this small, clean room and the dust-blasted gravel lot where the day had started felt like crossing between 2 separate worlds. And Dean's leather vest and road-worn boots looked almost surreal against the white tile. "The blood work will take an hour," Ruth said, hanging a second bag of fluids. "But I can already tell you the kidneys are stressed. If we can stabilize the hydration and get the temperature down, there's a chance, a real one. But tonight is critical." "I'm staying. Mr. Hargrove, I'm staying." Outside, something was happening that neither of them could see from the exam room. Colt Benson had made a phone call, then another. Then he'd handed his phone to Frank, who made 4 more. Within 30 minutes, a chain of communication had rippled out through the 800 riders spread between the clinic, the rally lot, and the bars and restaurants of downtown Kingman. And what came back was not just sympathy, but action. A rider from the Phoenix chapter named Walt Fredericks, who worked as an HVAC technician, showed up at the clinic with a portable cooling unit and set it up in the recovery room without being asked. 2 members from Las Vegas arrived with bags of premium dog food, blankets, and a crate they'd bought at the pet store on Northern Avenue. The cashier had stared at them like they were robbing the place until they laid cash on the counter and left with a polite nod. Kyle Ashford, the young prospect who'd been told not to touch the dog, had driven to 3 different pharmacies to fill the prescriptions Ruth called in, and he came back with the medication and a stuffed toy shaped like a bone that he set down outside the exam room door without saying a word. By sundown, a rotation had organized itself. 2 riders stood outside the clinic at all times, not as a show of force, but as a presence, a quiet declaration that this place and the animal inside it were under the protection of something larger than a single man's compassion. Dean stayed in the exam room. Ruth brought him coffee at 8 o'clock and found him sitting on the floor beside the table, his back against the wall, his eyes on the dog. "You should eat something," she said. "Not hungry." She sat down on the stool by the counter and looked at him for a long moment. The question she'd been holding back since that afternoon finally surfaced. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Dean was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the steady drip of the IV and the dog's breathing, which had slowed, not in the dangerous way it had been slowing before, but in the way that suggested the fluids were working, that the body was stepping back from whatever edge it had been standing on. "My daughter's name was Emma," he said. 16 years old, sweetest kid you ever met. Everybody looked at me and assumed she'd turn out hard, turn out mean, because that's what people think happens when your father rides with a club. They thought I was raising her in some kind of, I don't know, some kind of criminal training camp. He paused. She volunteered at an animal shelter in Prescott every weekend. She wanted to be a veterinarian. Ruth didn't move. She barely breathed. Car accident, 2014. Drunk driver crossed the center line on Highway 89. She was 17. His voice didn't break. It just went flat, the way a voice does when it's carried something so heavy for so long that it's worn smooth. After that, people said a lot of things. Some people said it was karma. Said a man like me, a man who lived like me, deserved to lose what he loved most. Like it was justice. He looked at the dog on the table. It was still. Its breathing was even. The tremors had stopped. This dog got thrown away because somebody decided it wasn't worth keeping. Somebody looked at it and saw what they wanted to see. A pit bull, a problem, a thing to use up and toss out. Same way people look at us. Same way they looked at Emma and assumed she was something she wasn't. He leaned his head back against the wall. I can't fix any of that. But I can sit here. Ruth Pemberton, who had driven to this clinic 3 hours ago with her pulse racing and her prejudice packed neatly alongside her medical kit, felt something shift in her chest, a wall she hadn't known she'd built, settling quietly into rubble. "Then sit here," she said. "I'll get you more coffee." The dog survived the night. At 6:14 in the morning, when the Arizona sky was the color of a bruise turning yellow at the edges, the pit bull mix opened its eyes for the first time since collapsing on Dean Hargrove's boot 14 hours earlier. Ruth was there. She had slept in the office chair for 2 hours and spent the rest of the night monitoring vitals. Dean was still on the floor. When the dog's eyes opened, brown, deep, clouded with exhaustion but unmistakably alive, the hard line of his mouth softened by a fraction that only someone watching closely would have noticed. The blood work came back better than Ruth expected. Kidney values elevated but not catastrophic. The white blood cell count was high, confirming infection, but the antibiotics were already doing their work. Temperature down to 102 by midnight and holding. The dog was not out of danger. It was malnourished, injured, and immunocompromised, and recovery would be measured in weeks rather than days. But it had crossed the invisible line between dying and fighting, and that was enough. Over the next 48 hours, Kingman witnessed something it had no framework for understanding. The ride for the Forgotten went on as planned that Sunday, but its character had changed. The rally became, in addition to its original purpose, a fundraiser for the dog's care. Frank Calloway stood on a flatbed trailer and told the crowd what had happened, simply, without embellishment, because the truth didn't need any. Riders who had come prepared to donate to the veterans' shelter reached into their wallets a second time. By afternoon, over $11,000 had been raised for the dog's treatment. And the Veterans Shelter Fund exceeded the previous year's total by 30%, as though the act of caring about one thing had unlocked the capacity to care about everything. The videos hit the internet like a match in dry grass. 14 million views in 3 days. A reporter from the Mojave Valley Daily News drove out to the clinic expecting a human interest piece and left with material for a 5-part series. She asked to interview Dean. He declined. "I didn't do anything," he told her through the clinic's front door. "The dog walked up to me. I just didn't walk away." That quote, 7 words, "I just didn't walk away," became the headline. It was printed on T-shirts within the week. A tattoo artist in Phoenix offered to ink it for free for any Hells Angels member who wanted it, and 17 took him up on the offer before the month was out. Ruth named the dog Grit because she needed something to write on the chart, and when she looked at that scarred face and those steady brown eyes, the word came to her and stuck. Dean didn't argue with it. The recovery was slow and uncinematic. Daily medication, carefully measured meals progressing from liquid to soft food, wound care for the infected paws, treatment for ear infections severe enough to have nearly destroyed the hearing on the left side. Dean came to the clinic every day. He drove in from his house on the west side of town, parked the Road King in the same spot, walked in through the front door, and sat with the dog. He didn't talk to it in the cooing, high-pitched voice that some people use with animals. He just sat nearby, sometimes reading a newspaper, sometimes on his phone, sometimes doing nothing at all. And Grit, slowly, incrementally, in the way that a wild thing learns to tolerate and then accept, and then seek proximity to a source of safety, began to close the distance between them. First, it would lie in the same room, then at the far end of his bench, then beside his boot, the geography of comfort that the dog's battered nervous system understood. On a Thursday afternoon in August, 4 weeks after the rally, Ruth was cleaning the exam room when she heard Dean's voice from the recovery area, low and rough and barely audible through the wall. "You and me got the same problem," he was saying. "People look at us and they see what they already decided to see. They see the scars and the size, and they make up their minds before we open our mouths. And maybe that's their right. Maybe people get to be afraid of what they don't understand. But that don't mean they're right about us. That don't mean we are what they think we are." A pause. "Emma would have liked you, would have. She would have had a name for you inside of 10 seconds, and you'd have been sleeping on her bed inside of a week." Ruth leaned against the wall and pressed her hand to her mouth and said nothing. Grit went home with Dean on a Saturday in late August. The dog rode in a sidecar Dean had borrowed from Frank. With a harness and a pair of welding goggles Colt had modified to fit a dog's face as a joke that turned out to be functional. The sight of a 240-pound Hells Angels president riding through Kingman with a brindle pit bull in goggles sitting upright beside him became, in its own way, as viral as the original rescue videos. The ripple effect was measurable. Ruth's clinic saw a 40% increase in adoption inquiries. The county animal shelter reported its lowest euthanasia numbers in a decade. 3 other motorcycle clubs in Arizona launched their own animal rescue initiatives, modeled on a framework Colt Benson had quietly drafted and distributed. Ruth Pemberton sat in her clinic office on the day the follow-up article ran, the recovery room empty for the first time in weeks. She thought about the afternoon she had driven to that gravel lot with her heart in her throat and her assumptions packed tight. She thought about the circle of men parting for her in silence. She thought about Dean on the ground with a dying dog on his leg and a dead daughter in his memory. She thought about what she had expected to find and what she had actually found, and the distance between those two things, and what it meant about the stories people tell themselves to make the world feel orderly and safe. She picked up her phone and called Dean's number. "How's the patient?" she asked. "On the couch. Won't get off it." That's normal. Soft surfaces are new to him. He's making up for lost time. "Yeah." A pause. "Doc? Yes? Thank you for picking up the phone that day. I know you didn't have to." Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that carried weight, the weight of a woman who had learned something she hadn't known she needed to learn. "Neither did you, Mr. Hargrove. Neither did you." She hung up and sat there in the quiet, thinking about 800 men on motorcycles who had looked at a broken dog and seen what most people refused to see in them, something worth saving. Outside, the Arizona sun was setting and the desert was turning gold.